Okay, so this is chapter 8. It is called The Market Revolution. So this chapter is going to describe the development of the Industrial Revolution as it comes to the United States and transforms really everything about American life. So let's start it. All right, so as I said, early in the 19th century, America's commercial ambition just completely remakes the United States. And it's not just going to be something that changes the country economically. It really changes every facet of life, as we'll see. It's going to affect people's everyday lives in ways that they couldn't have imagined. So between the Revolution and the Civil War, the old subsistence world is going to die. And by that we mean the vast majority of people living a subsistence lifestyle, meaning they're growing crops primarily for their own consumption. And maybe they're selling a little bit and getting a little bit of money, but primarily all they're able to produce is what they and their family need to consume. That's going to change, and now we're going to switch gears into becoming a commercial nation, a nation that is focused on using the market to buy and sell goods. And in the process, the United States integrated the technology of the Industrial Revolution into a new commercial economy. The Industrial Revolution was underway. It got started in Great Britain for a variety of reasons that we don't really have time to get into, but there are reasons why it does start in Great Britain, and it does give them the immediate advantage there of being the first ones to adopt these technologies. And in the United States at this time, steam is really going to power industry. That's going to change not till after the Civil War, which our class does not cover, but that will shift later on. But initially, it's steam that's powering this revolution. So again, the changes felt around the country. Even in areas that don't necessarily industrialize much themselves, they will see effects of this market revolution as well, as we will see. Again, more people are now growing crops for profit, not simply self-sufficiency. You will see the growth of vast factories and cities, specifically in the north, though again, the south and the west
are not going to be excluded from these changes, as we'll see. And some people are going to profit immensely from this. Some people are going to become extremely wealthy. We're not really into the age of the famous robber barons, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, etc. Those really come after the Civil War, but there are still certainly fortunes to be made in these early stages of the Industrial Revolution in America. And we're also going to see a growing middle class because if you have a large factory, you're going to need not just, the wage laborers to work in it. You're going to need people who are going to do clerical work, who are going to do your accounting. You're going to need lawyers. And so that's going to lead to a new demand for middle class people. There are costs, however, to the market revolution in the United States. As northern textile factories grow, and textiles are really going to be the first big industry in the United States, the demand for southern cotton is going to swell because how are you going to make textiles? You need materials for it. And we just so happen to have cotton plantations in the South. And they can supply this ready stash of cotton for these northern factories. And so because of that, the use of slaves is going to accelerate as well. So again, we see that the Industrial Revolution is not just affecting northern factory-driven cities. It's also affecting the South as well. It's affecting smaller farmers too. A lot of them that can't make that switch from subsistence farming to, farming for a profit are forced to give up farming and become laborers themselves, maybe in the textile industries or any of the other industries that are going to emerge at this time. And so as a result, you're seeing a growing lower class of propertyless workers, moving away from Jefferson's vision for America of, a land of these small farmers. We're moving it far away from that, as less and less people are owning their own slice of America. These propertyless workers are working for very low wages, and as a result are entering into what we call the cycle of poverty, where it doesn't matter how hard you work, your wages are so low that you're unable to get out of that cycle of poverty. And as we'll see at the time, they did not have other means of getting out of it as well. No aid, from the government, no education as a means of getting out of it, etc. All people were also affected by a series of depressions, which at the time they called panics. So remember that a hallmark of this market revolution is that goods are now increasingly being produced for sale, not necessarily consumption. Obviously, you're going to be consuming it eventually, but the idea is that your average farmer is not simply producing only for himself and his family. He is mainly producing goods for sale and then consuming other finished goods. So that's a huge change. And what is powering this or enabling this to happen? Well, a big thing is going to be improved transportation, which enabled a larger exchange network. You don't necessarily have to sell your crops in your immediate vicinity. You can now ship them longer distances. Also, labor-saving technology is improving the efficiency of many different industries. And because of this, you're seeing a separation of public and domestic spheres. So whereas before a majority of people, your work and your home were one and the same. If you're a farmer, your home is your work. You don't leave it and go somewhere to work. And now you're really going to start to see a shift in that. And we'll talk about it in some other industries as well. But again, there are also some troubling trends being introduced. Class conflict. We'll get more into why this is increasing in a little bit. Child labor is going to be used because their parents cannot make enough to support the family on their own. Children will have to go to work. There's going to be an accelerated immigration, which is going to cause conflict between new and old groups living in the United States. And again, as we mentioned before, the expansion of slavery, as more slaves are needed to produce specifically the cotton for these northern textile manufacturers. These new strains are also going to require new family arrangements and are going to transform U.S. cities throughout the nation, such as it existed at that time. So part of the reason why Americans were focusing more and more on selling things instead of simply just consuming what they grew was because the French Revolutionary Wars had pretty much devastated the European continent. So between about 1793 to 1850, there are a series of wars that were started by the French Revolution. And because the wars had completely devastated the countryside of much of Europe, a lot of farmers were completely ruined and unable to grow their own crops. People still need to eat. And so as a result, U.S. exports of our crops to Europe increase in value. They have a need, supply and demand. We have it. We're going to sell it at them at a pretty good profit. Now, at the time, internal transportation costs really limited the economic development, how far we could go with this. There's a demand, but we don't really have the means of getting crops grown, say in Illinois or Ohio or, someplace that's further west out to Europe. How do we do that? That's very efficient. Well, after 1812, so after the War of 1812 ends, a new national infrastructure was built, new networks of roads, canals, and railroads, which are going to help facilitate this shift in the market revolution. As a result, this transportation revolution opened the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. So now if you live west of the Appalachian Mountains, it's pretty easy, or easier, I should say, to transport your goods from your farm out into the rest of the world, to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. Significantly, New York State completed the Erie Canal in 1825, which helped to link the Great Lakes region with the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean. This meant that crops grown in the Great Lakes region, such as here in Illinois or Michigan or Indiana, Ohio, etc., could now be carried by water to eastern cities. And at the time, water is the fastest way to transport goods. Also, on the flip side, goods from eastern factories could make the reverse journey and come back to Midwestern farmers, so that you don't have to produce so many goods within your own home. You can now buy things on the market because they're easily transported to you throughout the country. And you can see after the Erie Canal is over on the map in blue. A series of other canals were built throughout the United States, which significantly opened up transportation throughout the country. On these canals, you also have another invention that's making them even more efficient, and that is the steamboat. So Robert Fulton established the first commercial steamboat service in 1807. By 1830, there were 200 in operation. And so this, again, the steamboat is not, it's not dependent on sail. It's not dependent on, manpower. It has a steam engine that's making it go. And so that's very, of course, important. Also, you have your first long-distance rail line in 1827. And by 1860, there were more than 30,000 miles of railroads throughout the United States. So again, these are increasingly improved ways by which farmers in the Northeast or Midwest could get their goods to various urban markets. Railroad development is going to be much slower in the South. It's not that they didn't have them. They just didn't have as extensive networks. One of the main reasons is they have very wide and deep navigable rivers. And so the need just wasn't there as it was in the North. But that's going to be significant later on when we talk about the Civil War. So just kind of keep it in the back of your mind. All right. So this transportation and communication revolution really reshaped the lives of Americans. Again, farmers that used to produce crops for their own family now turn to the market. So they're earning cash for what they previously consumed. And as we said before, with that reverse journey coming back from cities on the East Coast, they're able to purchase goods that they either had to make themselves at home or went without. So maybe now wives on the farm are freed up of a lot of these very labor-intensive jobs and can now do and pursue other things, like such as they don't need to make cloth anymore. They can buy cloth. They maybe don't need to grind their own grain into flour. They can purchase flour, etc. Additionally, at the time, Northeast and Midwestern farm labor was in short supply. If you are a single farmer trying to expand, but you don't have any people who want to come in and labor on your farms, that's a problem. How do you expand? You're only one person. You can only do so much. Well, ambitious farmers began to invest in new technologies to help increase their productivity. Between 1815 and 1850, new patents in agricultural technologies really took off. So, for example, Cyrus McCormick of McCormick Place here in Chicago, famously, probably what most people know him as now, but he was famous for inventing the horse-drawn reaper, which made it possible for you to reap your crops without having to do it literally by hand. So again, increased productivity. And also John Deere's steel-bladed plow, which was a great improvement on the wooden plows of the past. The market revolution also encouraged the growth of cities, and in the process really reshaped the lives of urban workers as more and more people come to cities to seek employment. Additionally, new technology and infrastructure paved the way for additional growth. The Erie Canal really secured New York City as the nation's largest and most economically important city. Meanwhile, the steamboat helped to turn cities on waterways such as St. Louis and Cincinnati into centers of trade in the West. And the railroad really made our very own Chicago an important trading center. We were at an important crossroads between East and West. And a lot of rail junctions were built at Chicago, turning it into the city that it is today, the significant city it is today. But remember, this is not something that's simply affecting people in the North. Slave labor is fueling the market revolution. So the textile mills in the North may have been worked by free laborers who were paid for their labor, but it was dependent on Southern cotton. If you don't have the cotton, you can't spin textiles, obviously. In the early 19th century, all northern states started the process of abolishing slavery. Vermont was one of the first. It included the abolition of slavery in their 1777 state constitution, so before we were even officially a nation. 1804, New Jersey was the last state to adopt a gradual emancipation. Many of them were gradual again, so they only promised to liberate future children, so not existing slaves. So because a lot of these emancipation policies in the North were gradual, it did proceed pretty slowly. By 1830, there were at least 3,500 people still enslaved in the North. However, when you compare that to the number in the South, in which you have, about 1.5 million enslaved people in the South, it's still a pretty significant difference. But for example, there were still elderly enslaved people living in Connecticut as late as 1848 because they were not part of that initial emancipation. However, there were growing free black communities who fought for their civil rights in these northern states. Some people in some New England communities, enabled free African Americans to vote and to send their children to public schools. So certainly a big difference from what was permitted in the South. Nationally, however, even though slaves are slowly being freed throughout the North, the slave population is growing despite all this. So to give you an idea, in 1790, there were less than 700,000 slaves throughout the United States. But by 1820, there's 1.5 million, and that number is going to increase. So you have a growth of slavery in the South, and at the same time, you're having a decline in slavery in the North, and this is creating very deep divisions that are only going to grow over time. So this is very serious and is obviously going to, as we know, develop into a very serious problem later on. And more than any other crop, cotton is really driving this process. So there were other kinds of plantations and small farms that had slaves that were growing other crops, tobacco, rice, indigo, etc. But cotton is the big one at this time. And the reason for that is at the same time that you have textile mills developing in the North, you also have the expansion of the use of this invention, the cotton gin. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. It's a simple hand crank device, as you see in the picture there to the right, that mechanically removed seeds from cotton so that you don't have to pick out seeds, and the seeds are very sticky, by hand. And so that, of course, sped up the process of growing cotton and made it much more profitable. And it allowed Southern planters to dramatically expand their cotton production. Again, you have water-powered textile factories in the North that are making cloth, and so the demand is going up. And you also have the British who are doing the same, and so there's a demand from Great Britain as well. And that's going to be significant to remember later on when we talk about the Civil War. So despite the fact that slavery is growing in the nation at this time, the United States ends their legal participation in the global slave trade in 1808. So after 1808, no more slaves can be legally brought into the United States. At the same time, we see a movement of slaves. About 1 million slaves are going to be removed from the tobacco-producing fields of the Upper South to the cotton fields of the Lower South between 1790 and 1860. And so we're going to see slaves who are going to be sold to a lot of these newly formed states like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, places where cotton are going to be heavily concentrated, Arkansas. As these states become states, for one, and also become more and more settled, and cotton is grown there, more slaves are sold into these regions. Okay, so let's switch gears and look back at the North for a minute. So early on in the Republic, laborers in any kind of manufacturing typically worked every stage of the production. If you're a shoemaker or you're a shoemaker's apprentice, you're pretty much making said shoe from start to finish. Same with any other manufactured goods. The next stage in the development of this process would have been the piecework stage. So this is where merchants or investors would send or put out, as they called, materials to individuals and families to complete at home. So maybe you'd have women who would sew this cloth together, and then they'd send it back to the owner, and the owner would give it to another laborer to finish, but it's being done in the home. So that's the second stage of the process. Now you're having machines, specifically in New England, who are replacing the putting out system and really the idea of manufacturing anything from start to finish. This is mainly due to the theft of British technology. Again, the Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain. So in 1789, a man by the name of Samuel Slater was able to recreate completely by memory, because of course he wasn't allowed to take any plans for these machines with him, and his luggage would have been searched. So he committed to memory how these machines work, came to the United States, and recreated a yarn spinning and cording machine in Rhode Island. An even bigger development, in 1813, Francis Cabot Lowell and Paul Moody recreated the power loom in Massachusetts. And in this way, that technology was brought to the United States, and it completely replaces the putting out system. So Lowell's vision in what became known as Lowell, Massachusetts, brings a lot of capital and technology to and entrepreneurs to the New England region, because they see that, well, there's these machines and they're very, very efficient, and this is the way of the future, and they want to invest in it. And as a result, the American manufacturing boom is underway. So craftsmen who can understand new markets and the increased demand for products are going to get in on the game. So this is very important, because the old paternalistic apprentice system is starting to give way to the use of unskilled labor who could be hired and fired as the market dictated. So, for example, as I said before, you might have a shoemaker, and you might have apprentices who would come and decide to apprentice with you. So they enter into a contract with you. They're going to work for you for 7 years, and in that time, they're going to learn the trade. They're going to help you in your shop. And again, they're going to help you produce these shoes. They're going to abandon that and the whole tradition of custom-made shoes entirely, and they're going to start using machines and unskilled workers who are now not learning to make shoes from start to finish, but are rather assigned one single repeatable task. So they don't really need any training. They're not going to be trained in a skill, hence they are unskilled workers. So apprentices, again, if you're a shoemaker's apprentice, we'll just use that example, though there were many different kinds. Typically, they were involved in long-term obligations between apprentice and master. So again, you would enter into a contract where you're going to apprentice to this master shoemaker or whatever it might be for like 7 years. However, the masters are now abandoning that system, and they're now turning into employers, and they have fewer obligation to the workers, because the apprentice would be given essentially room and board. You would live with your master while you learned that trade, and he would feed you and teach you the trade and so on. Now that's all abandoned. You now have workers, and you don't need to care for your workers in the same way that you would for an apprentice. So you have less attachment between the employer and employee. And you also don't have that shared bond of trade, because they're not training the workers for anything anymore. Now there's a class-based relation. You're no longer training somebody who's going to be just like you, another shoemaker. You have an unskilled employee, and you are their employer. So on the flip side, workers are freed from long-term obligations of the apprenticeship or the legal subjugation of indentured servitude. Theoretically, they can work when and where they want. However, as we'll see, that's not really practical and something that these unskilled laborers could actually achieve. So at the start of this market revolution, the expectation is that all men could start as humble wage workers and achieve position of ownership and stability. And all you need is hard work, right? Start at the bottom and get to the top. Well, we're going to see that that's not quite the case. Also, traditionally, wage work was looked down upon as a state of dependence, and it was suitable only as a temporary situation. Like if you were going to go labor for somebody else in like a factory, let's say, that would be something that you wouldn't do permanently. That's going to change as well too, as we talked about that cycle of poverty. People are going to get involved in wage work and going to be unable to get out of it. So again, the commercial economy often failed this promise of social mobility. Depressions and downturns, which happened quite frequently, could destroy businesses and reduce even owners to wage workers. And unskilled workers perpetually lacked good wages and any kind of economic security. They were forever dependent on the supplemental income from their wives and children, and thus unable to move up the social ladder. So wage workers face low wages, long hours, and dangerous working conditions. There's no OSHA, which is the government entity responsible for making sure that working conditions across the country are safe. That didn't exist. And so working conditions were quite dangerous, as you can imagine. And also class conflicts started to develop. So these are not the formal inequalities of the master-servant contract, but there's still a hierarchy evident. And some start to turn to strikes and unions in order to assert themselves to win both respect and better resources. Another major shift is that the market revolution is shifting work away from home. Again, if you're a farmer, or even if you're involved in piecework, or you're an apprentice, you're a shoemaker, these are things that would have been done within the home. Now that's shifting away and work is being done outside the home. Now it's almost shifting back, right? Even before COVID, but especially since COVID, it's accelerated the idea of working from home. So now work is coming back into the home, but since the market revolution, work and home were largely separated. Of course, not for everybody, but for most people. It also is going to transform Americans' notions of what is work. What is work? Again, it's something that happens away from home. And it additionally shifted what it meant to be an American man and an American woman. As more goods were available in stores, there was less of a need to produce these goods at home. And so as a result, the ability to remove women and children from work determined the family's class status. So if you were able to have a wife who did not work and children who did not work, that determined that you were at least middle, if not upper class. Now, this, of course, ignores the reality of women's work at home. Unless you are very wealthy, you have lots to do at home, cooking, cleaning, tending to the children. But of course, they didn't view that as quote-unquote work. And this, of course, would be possibly only for the middle class or the wealthy, but you had to be fairly well off. For people who were not well off, women and children were needed to work to supplement the low wages of many male workers. So the ideal of an innocent and protected childhood was something that was a privilege for the middle and upper class only. Poor children were typically unable to attend school, with some exceptions. Whereas at the same time, the education received by the middle class children laid the foundation for future economic privilege in the same way that receiving a good education today helps to secure your foundation in the future. Education for women was largely designed to help them live sophisticated lives, and was also used to allow them to take positions as teachers in an expanding common school system. Again, poor children were largely kept from school. When they were in some sort of school or education, it usually involved them also being simultaneously indentured to wealthy families as either field hands in farm work or as domestic laborers, being a maid, for instance, if you were a girl. So the idea of a romantic childhood, a period in which boys and girls were sheltered in the home and nurtured through a primary school system, was really something that was confined to middle and upper classes. And this allowed them to grow up and be able to achieve well-paying jobs that then would be shut out to poor children. So really, even the idea of a childhood in general is something that is a middle and upper class idea. It's not something that really even applies to working class poor people. Also, we're seeing a shift in gender roles as well. Men and women were expected to assume more distinct gender roles in which they occupied what they called separate spheres. So separate spheres including the private female world of home and the public male world of business. So the woman's sphere is the home and children. The man's sphere is business and work. This, of course, implies a distinct class bias. It's only possible in households where women were not needed to engage in wage labor. And the idea of, the working class man spending all of his income on alcohol is also going to be something that is going to be pervasive, as you can see And this political cartoon over to the right is the woman's at home caring for the children, cooking, cleaning, chaos, and her husband is out at the bar. Okay, so looking at the South, there was a similar domestic expectation in the slave states. White women were seen as too delicate for farm work, and of course this was not the case for slave women, who were of course not seen as too delicate, but for white women that was the ideal. So the Southern ideal was the white plantation mistress who was shielded from any kind of manual labor. However, a majority of white Southerners don't have plantations and they don't have slaves. And so as a result, those women had to assist by necessity with the planting. Additionally, white Southerners continued to produce a large portion of their food and clothing at home. They're not purchasing these goods ready-made as they would in the North. And so that doesn't free up women from that kind of labor. They also insist that their adherence to slavery and racial hierarchy made them morally superior to greedy Northerners. In their mind, the slaves are not free, but at least they're taken care of. There's more of a personal relationship between the master and the slave versus the callous, cutthroat, commercial, mindset of the North. Of course, obviously, there's a big difference in that the workers in the North, though not treated well, are free and the slaves are not, but they didn't see it that way. And increasingly, the North and the South are going to see their lives as incompatible, specifically in the South where they have the Southern ideal. They see their way of life as incompatible with the way of life in the North. In terms of women, their legal status is going to remain largely unchanged. At the time, married couples still represent a single unit that is headed by the husband. Women largely could not own money, own property, sue, or be sued. Divorce was only allowed in some states, and even then it was expensive and very difficult. And so you're at the same time that they don't have a lot of legal status, you also do see a shift from institutional to companionate marriage. So an institutional marriage, that's where it's basically a labor arrangement in which couples would assess each other's skills in the household production. So basically it's a business arrangement. And although people find it hard to believe, that's how most marriages were arranged at the time. Who can I be most profitable with? Now it's switching gears to a more companionate form of marriage in which character and compatibility are taken into account, though money is still essential. So the last major change we're going to talk about in this discussion of the market revolution is immigration. So between 1820 and 1860, 5 million immigrants are going to arrive in the United States. They are primarily Irish, German, and Jewish at this time. They come for a variety of push and pull factors, as we call them, things that push them out of their home countries and things that pull them into the United States. So starting with the Irish. In Great Britain, Parliament revoked the common land rights for Irish farmers. So this means that farmers can no longer graze their animals on common lands. And so as a result, they are unable to have animals and they are sunk into poverty. And this generally targeted Catholics as there was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment in Britain and also, as we'll see, in America. So the pull factor for them is going to be the booming U.S. economy. They come largely as unskilled laborers, and they come as a result of chain migration. So chain migration occurs when men come first, and they send back money to either support their families or to enable their families to purchase tickets to come and join them. Additionally, between 1840 and 1860, 1.7 million Irish are going to flee starvation from the famous Irish famine. Again, they're going to come as unskilled laborers, and they're going to be forced to take the dirtiest and most dangerous occupations in the country. There's a lot of anti-immigration sentiment against the Irish. As you can see in this political cartoon to the right, they're often depicted as being ape-like. However, despite the hostility, they largely retained their social, cultural, and religious beliefs. Germans are going to be a little bit different in that they're going to largely settle in the rural countryside. Over 1.5 million are going to come from the various German states. There is no united Germany at this time. There's just independent principalities. They are going to be fleeing declining agricultural conditions and failed political revolutions of 1848. They generally tended to travel as families, and they usually had more money than the Irish, and that enabled them to really jump right into middle-class trades. And they settled largely in what became known as the German Triangle of St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Cincinnati. Jewish Germans also transformed various regions. They tended at this time to come from southwest Germany and Poland. They also came as a result of chain migration or as family units, and they tended to settle in urban areas where they largely took up in retail, commerce, or artisanal occupations such as tailors. So this sudden influx of immigration triggered a lot of backlash among the native-born Anglo-Protestants, people who largely had come generations before from Great Britain. They were especially fearful of a growing Catholic presence, big anti-Catholic sentiment, as we said before. As you can see in this political cartoon, as they are depicting Catholics, the bishops as crocodiles, emerging from the water on America's shores. And so there's going to be a push to try to limit European immigration and prevent Catholics from establishing churches. There's also going to be the establishment of a political party that is against immigration, known as the Know Nothing or American Party. Improving European conditions are going to slow migration after 1855, though this will pick up again after the Civil War. So the Irish are going to swell the ranks of the working class, though they are going to encounter the politics of industrial labor, and they're going to form early trade unions. The labor unions are going to organize to limit working hours and to protect child laborers. They mobilize to establish the 10-hour workday. Women are actually going to be the first to launch the earliest strikes in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1834 and 1836. In 1842, child labor was still the dominant issue. And Massachusetts is the first to pass a law preventing children under 10 working more than 10 hours per day, which still isn't great, but at least it's some restriction. And in the 1840s to 1860s, they're going to slowly extend the age of protection and assurance of. So to conclude, Southern agriculture is going to be produced by enslaved labor, and it's going to be fueling Northern industry produced by wage workers. New transportation, new machinery, and new organizations of labor are going to be forming. Industrialization and a cash economy are going to tie diverse regions of the United States together. And the rise in industrial child labor, the demands of women to unionize, the demand of workers to unionize, the vulnerability of women, and the influx of non-Anglo immigration are going to leave many questioning the meaning of liberty after the market revolution. So our chapter question, in what ways did the market revolution permanently and positively affect American lives, and in what way did it negatively affect American life?